Tom? Miver's voice drifted through the roiling emotions that had enveloped him like a fog bank for the last few minutes. Please, Miv. I know we've gone through this for almost 2 hours, but it's a lot, he said with a grimace, staring at the map to their destination on the screen of the autocab. I'm still processing this. But still processing, he growled. Tom looked away from the map with a sigh and turned to face Miver. The estimated arrival time loomed large in his mind. With only 20 miles left in the trip, he had to wrap his head around this. All right. So, you're married. She nodded. And her name is Shalea. Yes. Her eyes were pleading as she nodded. Tom, I know I told you about her when we went to the party on Earth. It's just that I didn't get it. He winced at the look that flashed across her face. Look, I get that you told me. I even get why I didn't get it. When a man dies and widows his wife, the marriage is over. One man and one woman, that's just how things are. Trust me, I get it in spades. What I don't get is why you didn't tell me again. Because I was falling in love with you, she whispered, dropping her gaze to the floor, only continuing after a few seconds had passed. After all the years since Chanda was killed, I took myself off the market, held on to what I had with Shalea, and we kept each other safe. I love her, and the last thing I expected was to find myself falling for someone at first sight. All right, I can understand that, Tom started, but cut himself short. While he learned that he'd caught her eye because of his resemblance to her late husband, it wouldn't have been kind. Neither could he deny that he'd been just as struck by her appearance when they'd met. Despite his confusion at the whole upside-down logic that twisted everything like a pretzel, he got it. I wasn't what you bargained for, and I suppose I can say the exact same thing. I can even understand why you told me in the cab ride over, he said with a grimace. It's not like I can get up and walk out. It was a lot to process, and being fair, he wasn't sure he would have done anything differently in her place. The galling thing wasn't so much the situation as not having time to figure it out. No, but you can spend the weekend with me, or you can decide you don't want to deal with this, or even with me. I wanted to talk on the ride because this way you can decide if you want to take the cab back. Tom looked over, and Miver was there, gazing out of the window. Fear and resignation hung heavy in her voice, but now she wouldn't face him. That just left the choice to figuring things out on the fly. What an unholy mess. After the best part of a year together, all it came down to was making a choice about his feelings with this woman he loved, who was married, and doing it before. Before the cab arrived, Hope was standing out in the front patio, waiting like a protective big sister should. She hid a smile as Belder not quite scrambled out of the passenger compartment. After a few minutes speaking inside with Belder, Hope had called Liam down to the foyer. It was all very proper, and what any respectable Shavati girl should expect from a boy's family. Now she was waving goodbye and watching sternly as the vehicle drove off towards the city, like a good big sister. There were appearances a family matriarch had to maintain, after all. It was hard to believe it had been almost 9 years. 9 chill years, that was, since she had first set foot here, along with Pretty, Randy, and the others. She'd been so frightened, but now, against all expectations, this was her life. As the cab pulled out of view, she turned and walked back inside. Belder seemed like a nice girl. Truth be told, Liam had gotten very lucky meeting her and her school friends. Even so, she could have throttled him when he got back last week. While she had been thrilled to have him come for the year to see him after so long, It had taken him less than a month to charge off and do something that could have gotten him into serious trouble. She hadn't had time to notice he was missing the day he stole off to the human restaurant out in the suburbs, and, but she had torn him a new one when he got back. Belda herself had been mortified, and that slowed Hope down long enough to be properly thankful and show good manners, talking to the girl and thanking her for bringing him home safe. Not that it had spared Liam from another tongue-lashing after she'd left. At least, he'd had the good sense to learn from the experience. Liam was just old enough to be out on his own, and this trip to Shill was a big adventure for him. But it was clear that until he'd gone into town, that he hadn't appreciated how far in over his head he was, as a single male out on the street. He'd eventually admitted to being approached at least 4 times during his walk through town, and it seemed to have made the point for her. Thankfully, he slipped out for lunch. Even in a nice town like Pre-Longtori, it could have been a much different story if he'd been out alone towards dark. He understood that, now, and if it was a lesson learned without cost, but still, he'd been reckless. Not even a month for making her want to scream. This wasn't a trip to a new town, it was a new planet, new species, new rules. Having seen a few Shorvanti back home, and hearing stories was one thing, but being off Earth was different. What would she do if he'd snuck off without a word, and something had happened? Cripes, what would she have told Dad? The expectations were one thing, but the reality was another. After 9 Shill years, they'd become her new normal, though. From the snippets of news she got from home, people on Earth were coming to terms, but there was a way to go. Liam was proof there was still a big gap between knowing and understanding. At least he'd been able to fill her in with fresh news after he got here. From what he'd said, the Shill was still a rare sight in Canada, outside of the Marines. While a few hardy souls were starting to settle into the area for work reasons, Canadian winters were coming back with a vengeance thanks to the climate restoration program, and most of them didn't want to be there. Instead, it seemed it was the veterans that were the main source of the news. Humans had been joining the Shorvanti Marines and even the Navy for a few years now. At first it had been the old veterans who hadn't had anything else to do after the invasion, and more signed on with every passing year. As far as the military was concerned, humanity seemed to be a huge success. And while some never made it back alive, most were doing well. After 10 years, though, those in the first wave were retiring. While some never came back to Earth, others did. Hope wondered if it was like the old seafarers returning to settle down after their last voyage was done, telling tales of distant lands and the exotic things they'd seen. Their tales of excitement and danger were pulling in a new generation who wanted to go off and see the galaxy. There were still some holdouts from the Resistance, and when she thought about that, it gave her a chill. It wasn't the old fear, but there was an echo there she didn't think would ever go away. The fear itself had, though. She could even remember when it had happened. The meetings with Matrin had been a lot of it, as well as, well, it didn't matter. The Shorvanti were people, and now Sorgo Academy was her work and her home. It was funny how life had changed in ways she'd never thought possible, and Liam's news about the other women back home made her smile. After over a dozen years back home, women back on Earth were still adapting to being in leadership roles when it came to work. They had managed with reasonable success, but as for dealing with their home life... The governess of Saskatchewan had issued a statement that was long, well written for a human audience, and surprisingly polite. However, when you read between the lines, it came down to, if you want a baby, you have fertility clinics. If you want a man, up your game. At least they were going dancing, and Belda seemed to genuinely be a nice girl. Talking with her like a proper big sister would to any prospective date. Hope had to bite back a bit of a smile, as Belder had twisted uncomfortably, but answered Hope's questions. A farm girl from Willis, then. Well, a lot more rural than Shill, and for a boy like Liam, that wasn't a bad match. He'd even dressed up tonight, though she still couldn't make him get rid of that ridiculous hat. She just hoped they would be safe and have a nice evening. A nice evening was all she'd wanted, but as Mivere looked at Tom and Shalea, it was turning into a disaster. It wasn't as if she'd been naive. Telling Tom about Shalea in the cab had been a desperate gamble, but she knew Ganya was right. It wasn't like she could put off telling him, and she'd already put off seeing Shalea for the 3 weeks since she'd gotten back to Shill. While there had been an exchange of text messages, she knew they must have sparked suspicions. Perhaps she had been too vague? Putting off the meeting because of preterm week was something they'd had to do plenty of times. Surely she could understand how hectic this time of year was. Shalea taught younger children out in Krentori, and they'd been together for years now. At least telling Tom in the cab seemed to have worked. Mostly. She knew he was confused, but she held on to the fact that he'd continued to talk with her, and hadn't taken the cab back to the academy when they arrived. That was a thread of hope, as she clung to it like a lifeline. She had told Shalea she was bringing someone home, a man, who she needed Leah to meet. She hadn't expected the muted text back any more than the outburst that followed when Shalea got home. She knew Tom's resemblance to Chanda would be a shock for Leah, but she'd been stunned by the anger in her reaction. Mivere had found she could talk about anything with Leah, ever since the first day they'd met. Even if they had tremendous differences in background, Mivere never expected to find someone in her life who was so utterly her sister under the skin. They never argued once in all the time they'd known one another, which was why the pit in her stomach was yawning like the deep. It should be so simple. She had 2 people in her life that she loved. All that needed to happen was for them to see if they could care about each other. Instead, Shalea had launched into an angry tirade that Miv couldn't come to grips with. Not after the cab ride there. It was just too much. The one person she had always been able to talk to and confide in was rejecting her, and it tore her apart. Maybe it wasn't the womanly thing to do, but Miv shut down. She couldn't think of anything to say, and she left the room with a cry of anguish. Goddess. She had left Tom in there too. Everything was breaking. Breaking into a grin, Liam followed Belder as they took to the dance floor. This was the most fun he'd had in months, and while Belder had been a little nervous after they'd left the school, she'd calmed down. Hope hadn't been that bad after all. He couldn't believe he'd ever end up with his ear pressed to a door listening to his big sister quizzing his date. The ride in was good, though, and he asked a lot about Belder's school and how her classes were going. She'd been just as interested in him, too. The ride to Orinka Plaza had passed before he knew it, and the plaza itself? Wow. Orinka Plaza was on the top of a vast skyscraper, and while that might have been a few 100 feet back on Earth, on Shill, it was huge. When they got off the tram and took the elevator up, and up, along the outside of the building, the view had blown him away. The plaza took up the whole of a deck on the 120th floor, while the building continued to soar up for another 50 floors above them. Around them, the city spread out in all directions as the lights began turning the evening into day. They weren't even in the tallest building. It didn't matter. The plaza was alive like he'd never imagined, and Belder let him lead the way while he looked at everything at once. There had been a few stairs his way, and after some catcalls, boy, had he held onto her hand tight. What was great was that she held back, looking like she was proud just to be with him. Hell, that was harder to believe than the architecture. The dance floor was just too cool. There was a good beat going, if kind of slow. It seemed like club music had already been a thing on Shill. No real tune, but you could dance to it. Still, he took everything around him in stride, as Belder led him onto the dance floor. Hope had been right. It was all kind of backward, but that was fair enough. A bit weird too, but also not. Here he was on a different world, and his date was even an inch taller than him. There were all kinds of races on the dance floor too. There were Shulvanti, but also Rakiri and Helcom. Liam spotted a few night crew girls showing off their glowing stripes like living glow sticks, which was just awesome. But there were beings he couldn't even recognize. The whole dance floor was filled with people laughing and having a good time, while overhead lights speared into the crowd, and a Shulvanti male up on a podium seemed to be acting as a DJ. They were onto their third dance when the spotlight speared down on them both, and the DJ called out something to the crowd. "I understood about me being a human here, but I didn't get the last part, Belle," he called over the steady thump of whatever it was that was being played. "Oh, it was kind of slang," Belder called over the music with a blush, but she was grinning. "She asked if you're going to show us your moves." "If only. The music is good, but if I could play some of my stuff." "Oh, yeah, you can do that." Liam's jaw dropped, but Belder nodded happily. "Jax told me the DJs take requests, and they never know who else is going to show up. It's all part of the show, so if you have anything on your Omnipad..." "Oh, hell yeah!" he nodded, and happily grabbed Belder's hand. She yawked in surprise as he pulled her towards the podium, and he waved his Omnipad at the DJ to get his attention. It seemed impossible. He was a human, and only going to be on Shill for a year. It wasn't like she wouldn't have to go home to Willist when she graduated. But wow, he never expected to be treated this well, and he never had this much fun on a date in his life. What if what he was feeling was love? "If it was love, I would give that love every second I had, and I did." Shalea stared mournfully at the door that Mavere had fled through. It felt like the universe was leaving her behind, her life sweeping out of the room. She hadn't known where all of this would lead her to, all those years ago. Doing all of this for the love of a man named Chanda, and joining as his co-wife with Mavere and Amit. Would she have let it happen anyway, if she could have known how she'd be feeling at this moment? When Chanda and Amit died, it had been awful. Not only the sense of loss, but her life had been, and still was, nothing more than that of a teacher in Kriantori. Meeting Mavere at a teaching conference, and then Chanda and Amit, had been a whirlwind without easy explanation. She was no one, while all three of them were nobles. Reason played no part in her forming such a close friendship with Mavere, then finding love as part of their family. She brought nothing to their lives except herself, but somehow that had been enough. She had loved each of them so much. Every day for Mum she wondered how long it would be before they all knew more about her than they wanted. That would be the day with the teacher from poor and run-down Kriantori ceased to be any surprise. Nothing more of interest, no longer amusing or loved. She was certain for the first year that time was not on her side. That had proven true. The second year of her marriage was the happiest time of her life. Every day seemed to turn around a touch from Chanda, or a kind word or a smile from her co-wives. They had even been planning for their first child when Amit and Chanda were killed. No amount of planning could change that her life had been stolen out from under her. Her life had been taken from her, not because she was ordinary and unloved, but by nothing more than a stupid vehicle accident. Nothing she could change. Nothing she could fight. She had wanted to die. How could she not despise this man? This human? In spite of all sense, Mivert had chosen not to dissolve the marriage. Shalea knew exactly how much it was costing Mivert to keep things going between them. The cost that her niece was extorting from Miv, because she wasn't married and had no heir, was staggering, bleeding her house dry. That made her diverting half her salary to help keep the house and Shalea going all the more humbling and difficult to understand. She had loved Chandra and Ahmed. As the days after the accident turned into years, she finally come to accept that Mivert loved her back. Now, a few months off to Earth and she had come back with a man. Of course, Shalea had hard words. Despite Mivert's protestations, this was the end. It only cut deeper than this. This alien sitting on the couch, on their couch, looking at her in dismay, had the indecency to look so much like Chanda. Naturally, Mivert was happy. But who was she to this Tom Warwick? Nothing. And she knew it. It had taken 10 years, but now Mivert was moving on. Goddess help her heart. She was. She was already a mile off after dropping Liam off. But her heart was beating so hard, Belder was sure he could probably hear it. Her smile was going to crack her face. The plaza had been everything Jacksby had promised, but the dancing. Goddess, once Liam let loose, she hadn't come close to keeping up with him, but he'd held onto her hand the whole night. She thought she'd look clumsy and slow, but somehow he was good enough to work with that, and even made it work. She couldn't believe it when the whole club cleared a circle to watch them for 5 whole dances. She thought she'd been about to collapse when the last song stopped, and he held up a hand and kissed her. She could have died on the spot as the crowd went wild and cheered. Empress! She was only a girl from Willist. The rest of the night was like a blur, but he kissed her good night, and even asked when she was free again. Belder looked down at the file on her omnipad for what must be the 12th time, and stomped her feet with a squeal. Eeeeee! Her sisters back home would never believe her. Goddess! Even the girls back at the school wouldn't believe her. If not for that girl in Michigan, this would definitely be the worst state of his life. Tom watched Shalea with dismay after Mivert fled the living room. He decided to come inside after they reached Miv's house, hoping to sort his head out, meet Shalea, try and get his mind wrapped around the intricacies of their relationship. Despite his confusion during the ride over, Miv had spelled out her feelings for Shalea, as well as the ugly implications. There was something unpleasant going on. Every year that she remained unmarried to a man and without an heir, House Pelavon was legally considered a dying entity. So every year a large percentage of his income was raked off to her niece, Alea. In the eyes of the law, it left enough for a single woman to support herself, presumably in her old age while passing on her wealth to a younger woman who could create a thriving family. For a younger woman like Mivert Pelavon, it had been a carrot to remarry, and a stick to beat her with if she didn't. To add salt into the wounds, it was this secret that little bitch Alea was holding over Mivert. Tom had explained gay marriages to Miv back on Earth when the subject came up, and learned how disgraceful it was considered in Shilvanti society for a man to take themselves off the market. He had mistaken her muted response for thoughtfulness at the time, instead of what it was. Shilvanti society had things to say about a noble woman, who kept herself off the market by choice. Mivert wasn't a social pariah, but keeping her marriage legally alive out of love for her co-wife made her no less a martyr. Keeping that secret for all these years was also the stick Aaliyah and the rest of her family could beat Miv with, whenever they liked, so long as they kept her secret. He really wanted to wrap his head around the situation. Certainly Shalea coming at him with such anger was the one situation he wanted to avoid. Now, with immaculate timing, Mavere had fled the room, leaving him here to face Shalea alone. Embarrassed, marooned in a strange house on the far side of the city, and wondering what he could possibly say. It was daunting, frightening. Maybe she's scared too. The thought arrived unbidden, but Tom could see the truth in it. Anguish and distress had washed over Shalea's face when Miv fled the room. He was alone with her here, yet she was pacing the room in a panic as if he wasn't even there, even more alone than he was. If he didn't say something soon, there was no way this could end well. "You know, I hadn't expected this," he began. As ways had been introduced, Mavere did her best, though it's not exactly... "It is what it is," Shalea said bitterly. She stopped pacing to look at him. "What else could it be? This situation is as straightforward as it gets." Tom blinked. Straightforward is the one thing it isn't. Not to me, anyway. He took a deep breath and tried again. "She loves you. Can you please understand? As upsetting this is for you, and confusing as it is for me, that she loves you. I love her too. I don't think I understood half the pitfalls I might have until the ride over here, and I won't even pretend to understand all that's going on in between the lines, but I am not here to be a homewrecker." An expression of haunted insecurity passed over Shalea's face, and Tom knew in the moment that he had to take the initiative, whatever that might be. Look, this can't be the first time this has ever happened, and she made it absolutely plain that, as much as she cares about me, she cares about you. So I get it, I'm the outsider here, but I don't want to be dangerous to you. Put aside that I'm human and tell me, please, because I am a human and I honestly don't know. What would a normal family do in a situation like this? "If you were Shilvanti," Shalea said, looking at him warily. "Yes, don't stop. What would happen?" If I were with my chosen wife of choice, my Corley Pabrin..." Shalea seemed to think it over for a moment, and she closed her eyes. "We would open negotiations with the matriarch of your family." "All right, I get that. But my mother is dead, I'm widowed, and my stepsister is a few thousand light years away," he said, picking at the idea. Shalea was a contrast in appearance to Mavere, but he knew nothing about her as a person. At least he could get her talking. The Imperium is huge. So what if there's no other family around? "Well, traditionally that means that the co who met the man would set up a date between them all and see what happens." Tom gave her a tentative smile. "All right. I promise you I am not intruding to break up your life, Shalea. No schemes. You love Mavere and she loves you. I know you don't know me, but yes, I love Mavere. So, as the code just meeting me, how do we do this?" Shalea searched his face for a moment, then sighed, looking down at the floor. "You look like him, you know. Our husband," she said quietly. "Why can't you be what you ought to be?" "I'm just a guy who was crazy about a girl, who is also crazy about a girl. So..." Tom groped desperately for something to say that wouldn't sound so ridiculous, if only to his own ears. "I sing a lot, and it was a day or two back Miv asked why I changed my song from when we met. I told her I don't feel that way I used to. She made the light when she found me, and I don't feel lost anymore." "What's that have to do with anything?" Shalea asked warily. "Because I have a new song these days," She was my only hope, and I'd been wondering if she could really care for me. It took me the longest time for me to just tell her I love her, because after 12 years locked inside myself, I've been daring to believe she set me free. I can understand that, Shalia said quietly, as she stood before the picture window looking out over the bay, and hugged her arms to herself. We both care about her. Tom canted his head as he looked Shalia in the eyes, perhaps really seeing her as she was for the first time today. So, she nodded hesitantly, returning his gaze. Would you like to go on a date? It's a date, Mavisti Riche said with biting satisfaction. We have the human, Tom Warwick, locked in for an interview on the second day of next shell, and I have him all to myself for the first day and the evening before that. She juggled her omnipad and made a note on her desk before she continued. You get to come with me for the first night, and he'll be all primed for it. And when you bring the writer over the next day, we'll gaff him like a fish and haul him in. The interview is going to be on the up and up, though. I want him turned into a public figure. Just think of it. He's one of the first humans living here on Shill, and it's not like anyone ever gets an interview with the prince. Goddess even knows where he is most of the time, Mavisti smirked. I may have promised him I'd let my daughter Nessa off the hook, but what we're going to earn with the book royalties will more than make up for it. All you have to do is make it sound good during the interview, and then we'll get our pound of flesh later on with the book. That little stiff is going to be sorry he ever tried to mess with me. Out in the hall, Nessa shrank back from the open door to her mother's study, where she'd heard every word of the call. She slipped back up the corridor quietly before running for her room. It had all been a trade. Her mother had traded her life and thrown her away just for a book deal, and she was even happy about it. As she closed the door to her bedroom, she gasped for breath and fought the tears away. She'd been so happy when she came home for the weekend. Her mother had even promised a meeting with the writing department if she graduated with high marks. Of course, her mother still implied Nessa might get over this phase and rise to management in the future. Mother Mavisti wouldn't let her go even then. But just when it seemed her whole future was opening up, it turned out it was all just a setup. Oh, she knew her mother. She'd go through with her deal, letting Nessa off the hook, but only at the cost of double-crossing the professor and doing goddess knew what. Her first thought was to call one of the girls back at the academy, but she stopped herself short. It was too humiliating. How could she ever tell the others that her mother was planning something this awful? She had to warn him when she got back to the academy. She could get him alone after class. After class, I can show you the rest. Belder's voice floated into the hall, and Desala plastered a smile on her face as she came into the classroom. They were all gathered around the Willis girl. It was just so pathetic. Even Letzi was crowding in for a look. What's he like? She asked, leaning in along with the rest of the gaggle of excitable idiots. Talk about stamina. I thought my feet were going to fall off, Belder grinned. Jasmine told me to take him dancing, and you just wouldn't believe what he was doing. Oh, goddess, you heard humans are fast. Well, hey there. Desala arched her brow as she moved next to Letzi. What's all the excitement about? I have a boyfriend! Belder looked over at Jaxme, and 2 or 3 of her closest cronies, and smiled. He's a human from Canada. Desala rolled her eyes. It was all just too much, especially coming from this nobody from a farming planet. Still, she flounced and kept her tone light, her grin as nice as it was predatory. Sure, she said, tossing her hair back before shaking her head. A human from Canada? I don't believe you. The Willis girl had the nerve to stick her tongue out at her, before smiling at the others. Good thing the DJ sent me the video then, isn't it?